American tradition. Every 4 years, politicians and their parties take center stage. Star-making speeches.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
Infamous moments.
It's my turn.
And of course, balloon drops. We'll take you behind the spectacle because the history of conventions is the story of American politics.
All of us pledging allegiance to the Stars and Stripes.
This is an NBC News Now special. Party Animals, politics' biggest show. Today, political conventions may seem like slick, highly produced, days-long infomercials, but they used to be messy and loud. They were part of how our American democracy worked, as both parties gathered to nominate their candidate for president. Even today, that messiness is still there, just under the surface. And it's what makes these conventions still great today. In a world of scripted moments, there's still always the element of the unexpected.
A kiss that makes everyone look away, or a speech that sounds oddly familiar.
My parents impressed on me the values, like that you work hard,
for what you want in life.
That your word is your bond,
that you do what you say you're going to do.
Here at NBC News, we've been producing convention coverage for decades, and our archives include silent film footage dating back to 1916, before the invention of television. In the beginning, the TV production equipment wasn't really welcome.
I'm sorry that the microphones are in your way, but they have to be where they are because I've got to be able to see what I'm doing.
And the bulky TV headsets could get in the way when the convention broke into chaos.
This is John Chancellor on the floor. I'm looking down at Edwin Newman in the middle of a huge bunch of security people. How this got started, we don't know. Your microphone is broken, Ed.
It was an altogether wilder and shabbier affair than what we're used to today.
NBC News has learned from a reliable source that Senator Muskie of Maine has been chosen to be the running mate of Vice President Kennedy, Vice President Humphrey, let me say, in the 1968 campaign.
Beginning in the 1830s, Democrats and later the Republicans would gather to vote on the person they wanted on the ticket. And even back then, the conventions included a little image management.
This is one of the earliest convention pieces we have, and this is a Lincoln rail, the rail splitter president in 1860 in Chicago. John Hanks, one of his cousins, another gentleman carried in two large rails, fence rails, that John Hanks attested were rails split by he and cousin Abe when they were young men for Abraham's father.
Want to show he's a man of the people, look, he did hard labor just like anybody else.
Absolutely. So Lincoln the lawyer, who doesn't do hard labor anymore, becomes, once again, Lincoln the rail splitter.
And do we really think those were rails that were split then in 1860? Probably, you know.
Maybe. It's a good story.
Little image management even before the age of TV, huh?
For most of American history, the primary process didn't play a big role in how we picked presidents. The convention picked the candidate.
The delegates chose John W. Davis of West Virginia.
For the first 150 years of political conventions, that's all there was conflict. It could go to 103 ballots.
Conflict?
Healthy conflict, sometimes not.
In 1952, Republicans nominated Dwight Eisenhower for president. 2 weeks later, Democrats met in Chicago without a clear nominee. Earlier in the year, President Harry Truman tried to lobby then Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson to accept the nomination.
And Truman asks him to be his successor. He wasn't sure he'd run again, and he said, why don't you run for the Democratic nomination? And Stevenson turned it down. He said, no, I'd rather run for re-election as governor of Illinois.
In late July, the Democrats met in Chicago, and Stevenson gave them a welcome speech that changed everything, whether he wanted it to or not.
Self-criticism is the secret weapon of democracy.
Adlai Stevenson spoke in 1952, gave a great speech. So what this did was it created a groundswell for Stevenson to be nominated, and a year he did not want to run, thought he would lose, turned out to be right.
He gave a glorious speech, at which time the Democratic Party said, let's nominate him. And that was the end of the game.
We will never apologize for our leadership of the great events of this critical century all the way from Woodrow Wilson to Harry Truman.
Conventions then were all about deal-making, smoke-filled rooms, and most importantly, power. On the convention floor, the fights could be loud and drawn out.
There's considerable excitement down here on the floor. Apparently, someone has been hurt.
But radio and TV scrambled things up and changed how conventions would work.
We take it for granted that the candidate's going to show up and give his acceptance speech or her acceptance speech in person. That wasn't always the case.
Right.
And the first person to do that was Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. And although this is not,
it was a big deal that he
it was
showed
a
up.
very big deal. It was a big deal that he flew, and it was a big deal that he came in person. And
it was actually seen, to show up at your own convention was seen as actually like a little desperate. Right?
And not dignified.
Right, yeah.
You should be letting other people do the talking for you.
Right.
But what we see from that moment on is New Deal was a phrase he used in that acceptance speech. And so not only is it the first acceptance speech, but it's a great example of how that speech then spins out the rest of the campaign culture. And we had
his entire presidential message.
That's right.
FDR recognized the power radio gave candidates to reach more voters, even if the convention was a little unsettled by modern standards. It was the beginning of the transition from the chaotic conventions of the past to the polished TV shows we have today.
It's largely a coronation, so to speak. I mean, there's not a lot of procedural things that happen that have not already been worked through.
This announcement came from Senator Kennedy not very long ago.
The most famous example, and maybe the last time we'll see any questions about the ticket, took place in 1960, when JFK shocked everyone and picked his primary rival, Lyndon Baines Johnson, as his running mate.
That's a great story.
I've reached the conclusion that it would be the best judgment of the convention to nominate Senator Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas for the office of Vice President.
There was no primary system to guarantee anybody the nomination. This was up for grabs. The one time where the delegates in that room decided, Jack could be cold calculating and think in terms of what works for him. And so the morning of after he'd won the nomination for president, Jack Kennedy gets on the phone, calls up Lyndon Johnson and says, I'll be up there at 10:30, let's talk. And then he walked into the room, they're both at the same Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles, and they offered him the vice presidency. He offered it to him.
The motion is that the rules be suspended and that the Honorable Lyndon B. Johnson be declared the nominee for vice president by acclamation. As many as favor the motion will vote aye.
And Kennedy had promised the nomination for vice president to Stu Symington the night before. He had actually promised him.
Wow.
So he got up and said, you know what? I'm looking at the electoral map. You know, he's like Steve Kornacki. He's going, no, here we go. We got to look at the map. And the map says, if you don't carry the South, you're losing.
And that was the real purpose of the conventions in those days. The party might show up with different factions, but they would leave unified behind their ticket.
Here comes the vice president.
In the first days of the convention, passionate delegates would try to organize and boost their chosen man, or talk up a state's favorite son. Over time, conventions became a place to find future presidents and to weed out the weak ones. The most obvious example of the power of the keynote speech is Barack Obama's 2004 address to the Democratic Convention in Boston. At the time, he was simply a candidate for the United States Senate.
There is not a black America and a white America and Latino America and Asian America. There's the United States of America.
But in the years before Obama's speech, the keynote played a major role in showing us the future of a party.
The keynote address is an enormous audition for someone who is thought of as a future presidential candidate. Sometimes people rise to the occasion, sometimes they do not. In 1956, Adlai Stevenson tried to give John Kennedy a boost by letting him give the keynote address, which Kennedy did, had a lot to do with the fact that later in the week he was almost nominated for vice president.
You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay, there is a point beyond which they must not advance.
In 1964, an actor and newcomer to politics at the time addressed the Republican convention in support of Barry Goldwater.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
And in 1984, New York Governor Mario Cuomo a potential future presidential candidate, gave one of the all-time classic speeches.
Mr. President, you ought to know that this nation is more a tale of two cities than it is just a shining city on a hill.
But even in the television era,
We want Glenn!
the unexpected can still happen. In 1976, American hero John Glenn and his boring keynote speech basically shut the door on any future presidential ambitions.
A problem not easily defined, not easily addressed by a platform, and not easily discussed in a keynote speech.
John Glenn at the same convention was given the same opportunity.
American hero.
American
American hero.
As he was and still is, but this was not exactly his venue, and he muffed the opportunity.
Besides the keynote, those who lost the nomination fight can sometimes use their speaking slot to settle a score. In 1992, Pat Buchanan mounted an unsuccessful primary challenge against George H.W. Bush.
Listen, my friends.
Despite challenging the sitting president, Buchanan was given a speaking slot at the Republican convention that would change everything about convention speeches, and not just because of what he had to say.
There is a religious war going on in this country. It is a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself, for this war is for the soul of America.
You know, in '92, the Bush family got a lesson in if you don't control your primetime speaking slots, you could have Pat Buchanan's primetime speech defined that second Bush quail ticket in a way that the Bush quail ticket didn't want.
Yeah, that's right. And now, even after that moment, you see so much more scripting.
Yes.
I mean, people want the speeches in advance. They want to approve the speeches. You get individuals who will occasionally just walk up and do their own thing, and so you do lose a little bit of control over it, but it's a tight process with a stage manager, a program manager.
Sometimes self-promotion reveals what's going on under the surface at a convention. In 1980, Senator Ted Kennedy challenged Jimmy Carter for the Democratic nomination, even though he eventually, slowly, raised his arm in support of Carter. Kennedy gave a speech that showed why people had rallied behind him in the first place.
For me, a few hours ago, this campaign came to an end. For all those whose cares have been our concern, the work goes on, the cause endures, the hope still lives, and the dream shall never die.
In 2016, another senator named Ted, this one, Texas Senator Ted Cruz, proved that no amount of choreography can control what someone might say when they get on stage. Cruz had challenged Donald Trump for the Republican nomination and hoped the convention might still pick him.
Stand and speak and vote your conscience. Vote for candidates up and down the ticket who you trust to defend our freedom and to be faithful to the Constitution.
I think he probably went into that moment hoping that there would be this groundswell in the moment, that he was the more acceptable Republican than Donald Trump. It wasn't even close.
But the stakes for his speech were probably never higher than in 2008, when John McCain picked a little-known governor from Alaska to be his running mate. For most people, Palin's speech at the convention would be the first time they heard from her.
Now they say the difference between a hockey mom and a pit bull? Lipstick.
So you were in the room when Sarah Palin sort of made her national debut. I mean, that speech, I remember, I mean, it took a lot of, like, wow, where did she come from?
Yes.
It was quite a moment.
It was a great moment, and she was an amazing person to put on that stage in that moment. She gave an incredible speech. She certainly, before any of the issues that came after were well known, she was electric in that room.
I might add that in small towns, we don't quite know what to make of a candidate who lavishes praise on working people when they're listening, and then talks about how bitterly they cling to their religion and guns when those people aren't listening.
She connects with people in a way that not many politicians do, and it's because there is a real authenticity about her, even if you don't politics aside. She was very good in that moment.
Coming up, even in the scripted television era, conventions featured a little of the rowdy and uncontrolled.
Political conventions evolved hand in hand with television. First, there were network newsmen carrying their gear on their back. Eventually, cable TV picked up the ball and expanded coverage to include everything around the convention floor. Some people rejected the changes that television had on politics.
Now, this idea that you can merchandise candidates for high office like breakfast cereal, that you can gather votes like box tops, is, I think, the ultimate indignity to the democratic process.
But the more successful candidates embraced the change.
Is there really any doubt at all about what will happen if we let them win this November? Is there any doubt that they will raise our taxes?
Reagan always looked tanned. He always looked great on television. He radiated, is a good word for him.
It's what they've done to America in the past. But if we do our job right, they won't be able to do it again.
At their peak, each party was trying to use the convention to create a moderate message and reach the widest possible audience.
To some of that, you want to shape it. You want a big, beautiful television event. Certainly that was the case.
That's what you viewed it as.
Yes.
You viewed it as a television show.
A big, beautiful television show.
And the parties took pride in showcasing diversity. In 1972, Anne Armstrong, the Republican Party co-chair, became the first woman to deliver the keynote address at any national convention.
We have a choice before us that transcends personality and partisanship alike.
In 1984, Jesse Jackson delivered a speech that pointed the way to his second presidential campaign in 1988.
As I develop and serve, be patient. God is not finished with me yet.
No matter how polished the convention might be, there are some things that the convention planners and TV producers can't control. The Republican National Convention was interrupted by hurricanes in both 2008 and 2012. In 2008, that meant that the sitting president, George W. Bush, didn't speak at the Republican convention. In 2012, one of the people who lost his speaking slot was Donald Trump. In 2020, the COVID pandemic forced both parties to scale back their conventions and look for ways to hold events without indoor crowds. The restrictions ushered in all kinds of new features to the conventions, especially the virtual roll call.
The calamari comeback state of Rhode Island casts 1 vote for Bernie Sanders and 34 votes for the next president, Joe Biden.
Ain't no college for the people, just for the people, don't stop.
Then there's the biggest wild card of all, the protests. TV coverage really picked up steam in the 1960s, at the same time as the Civil Rights Movement. In 1964, at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, a group of black Mississippians who were part of the Freedom Democratic Party said they had been excluded from their state's political process. The Freedom Democrats tried to challenge the Mississippi Democrats and enter the convention hall so their vote could be heard.
I'm absolutely committed to the aims and aspirations of the Freedom Democratic Party and to the seating of this party.
And then there's Chicago, 1968. Protests over the Vietnam War took place inside and outside of the convention hall.
Humphrey lost in 1968 by 400,000 popular votes. And a lot of that came from Convention Week, when Americans saw hippies confronting members of the Chicago police, blood on the screen, people denouncing the candidate, Hubert Humphrey, on the night of his nomination, an anti-war majority, anti-Vietnam War in the Democratic Party that was basically ignored for the nomination of Hubert Humphrey. If Americans were watching, and they really were, because the drama was at its height, they were seeing a party that did not look as if it was ready to go back to the White House.
First of all, you wish you were there. It was the most exciting convention ever, and not just in Grant Park, not just with the students and the awfulness went on between the police and the students, and it was all on television.
We can now count New Hampshire, Mississippi, Colorado, Oregon, Wisconsin,
Nebraska, Alaska, and Vermont, who have joined New York in this extraordinary demonstration of anti-war sentiment on the convention floor.
The convention was vicious outside, and it was vicious inside.
Particularly NBC's reporters and camera crews in Grant Park have turned in a performance that certainly is above and beyond the call. They've had their heads smashed, they've been sprayed with tear gas, their cameras grabbed and destroyed. That, plus the difficulties we expected, difficulties in live coverage caused by the telephone strike, has made this one of the most difficult assignments they've ever had.
And to this day, it seems as if the scripting of conventions, it was almost incentivized by all of those unscripted 68 moments, right?
Absolutely. And just after the 1968 convention, when all that people saw practically out of the Democrats in Chicago was blood in the streets, Richard Nixon stages a motorcade for himself in Chicago, down the main streets, and there's no violence and nothing but cheers.
After 1968, the protest movement died down, and for those trying to use the conventions to win over Americans, the sight of protest became an unwelcome sign of chaos. By 2004, conventions were largely closed off to the public, with each event surrounded by more and more security. But still, surprises persist, especially when the party isn't unified. And in 2016, both parties were fraying.
You are ignoring delegates who have been elected to this convention. Roll call vote! Roll call vote! Roll call vote!
The internet, cable, and social media were all challenging TV for dominance, and the competing narratives played inside and outside of the conventions.
USA, USA.
By 2016, our politics evolved away from two Big Tent parties trying to win over the center, and instead focused on activating their voter bases. But the change was fast. As recently as 1996, Bill Clinton and Bob Dole were trying to craft a similar message to the middle.
Let me be the bridge to an America that only the unknowing call myth. Let me be the bridge to a time of tranquility, faith, and confidence in action.
At the time, Clinton's team was struggling with a convention message, but they took Dole's bridge metaphor and flipped it on its head.
But with all respect, we do not need to build a bridge to the past. We need to build a bridge to the future, and that is what I commit to you to do.
In less than a decade, the mood would change. Delegates and viewers wanted to see someone fighting for their point of view. In 2004, Georgia Democratic Senator Zell Miller addressed the Republican National Convention with a fire and brimstone speech attacking his own party's nominee.
George W. Bush wants to grab terrorists by the throat and not let them go to get a better grip. For John Kerry, they get a yes, no, maybe bowl of mush that can only encourage our enemies and confuse our friends.
So Zell Miller comes on from remote, a big camera showing him on remote from the convention hall. And he gets mad at me because I'm challenging him. And I said, what do you mean the Democrats are only going to use spitballs to fight the Cold War? And he said, that's a metaphor. That's a metaphor. And I said, well, what's it a metaphor for?
Wait a minute. Jim Jefferson, Vermont, switch parties after getting elected. If you're going to ask a question. Well, that's a tough question. It takes a few words. Get out of my face. If you're going to ask me a question, step back and let me answer. Senator, you know, I wish we lived in the day where you could challenge a person to a duel. Now that would be pretty good.
This was now the era of partisan warfare.
Coming up, more on the history of conventions and how they change history.
Read my lips.
Poor George. He can't help it. He was born with a silver foot in his mouth.
For lovers of politics, there is a joy in the conventions, whatever you have to say about them. Outside of election days or debate nights, they're the only time when politics takes center stage for the entire country. In 1988, Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton gave the nominating speech for Mike Dukakis that went twice as long as it was scheduled.
Yes, he went on the Tonight Show afterwards and joked about how long he had spoken.
I thank you for coming here tonight, and my first question is, how are you?
And again, in 1988, it wasn't Michael Dukakis on the Tonight Show. It was Bill Clinton on the Tonight Show.
Yes, that's exactly right.
You know, so much of presidential politics where 92% of the public has already decided. They're decided today. You're trading on the margins of that relatively small percentage, and you can do more harm with a mistake.
So I've got Mr. Obama sitting here, and I just was going to ask him a couple questions.
The Clint Eastwood empty chair strikes me as one of those you're like, oh, that was a pretty good convention but for.
I'm not going to shut up. It's my turn.
And even though there was nothing particularly damaging about that incident, you don't want to be upstaged.
The thing about conventions, these giant parties that are one part Congress, one part parade, is that they are really a celebration of our democracy, of people coming together to pick their leaders. And if giant celebrations of democracy don't move you, at least there's always a balloon drop.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.